Hello, I'm Jan Painter, and I want to welcome you again to our program, Politics Matters. We're very pleased to continue our discussion with Professor Paul Gaston, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Virginia. Welcome back, Professor.
Well, it's my honor to be here.
Professor, why did you decide to teach history at a Southern university? I know you had the opportunity to, you had the offer to go to Princeton as well, and back to Swarthmore. What factored in your decision?
When I met Mary in college, we were in the same year. We both started a year up, a year beyond where I suppose we should have been. I said, and we had the same feelings about racial inequality, and there's something ought to be done about it. Because of the place where I had grown up, justice came when you restructured society with the school, the colony, these things. We had these things so that once people became accustomed to a different way of living, then they would change. We wanted to be involved somehow in the world that was changing the South, and it was pretty clear in the early 50s that was a big issue in the country, and we wanted to be part of it.
Well, I know that Mr. Jefferson believed strongly in egalitarianism. He de-emphasized titles, and I'm assuming that those things, as a Fairhoper, appealed to you. What did you find from 1957 on when you came here? How did the reality and the expectation of that egalitarianism fit together for you, or did it?
I don't know that I really expected. Well, I thought that the university was, in a sense, at war with itself. It didn't know that. It had a lot of cognitive dissonance, I think. But it was the Jeffersonian ideas. I mean, you could argue with that Jefferson had slaves, and according to this recent book, that he treated them pretty badly. There's a difference of opinion about that. But what I thought of, and what a lot of scholars thought of, people like Dumas Malone and Merrill Peterson, who Dumas was the Jefferson professor when I came here, and Merrill succeeded him. And I thought both of them had a point of view which they described as a Jeffersonian point of view, which would not be, in a sense, it would be like what my grandfather had said, well, the integration, that would be the right principle, but it's the wrong place.
Well, that was what occurred to me as I was reading the book, was that this theme kept resurfacing, which was, again, how do you conjoin two rather opposing points of view? How do you accomplish your goal in the case of Fairhope of establishing the community, not having it been shut down at a time when there was no integration, and then you come to UVA and you have Board of Visitors and townspeople who are not in love with the idea of integration. So how do you approach this and not compromise your principle, which to me goes to the heart of what occurs throughout your book, which is remaining true to yourself, and yet being pragmatic in order to accomplish your goals, what every dissenter faces.
Well, life was easier for me. Partly because the students, or some students, played a leadership role. For example, in 1960, I think it was, there was a movie theater at the corner.
It's the University Theater?
University Theater. And they did not admit black viewers to the theater. There was no segregation because they didn't have a balcony, and you couldn't have segregation if you didn't have a balcony. So a black student, very interesting guy, I keep up with him now, he's teaching somewhere up in Massachusetts. He was admitted as a graduate student in history, and he had been a member of SNCC, the Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the organization for the youth in the civil rights movement. And his name was Virginius Thornton. And Virginius was pretty well fed up with, and he was a real activist, always involved. He got arrested going into a library in, I can't remember, Petersburg maybe. And he got into Virginia as a graduate student in history. And he decided to organize a boycott of the University Theater. 2 years later, after we'd had a sit-in and caused a lot of people to change, including the University Theater, they had decided that they would now be open to blacks as well as whites. And but that time, there was a clear picture of how the students, the majority of students, felt. In addition to boycotting the theater, the protesting students also picketed.
You yourself were very involved with a stand-in, or stand-out, I guess it is, at Buddy's restaurant. I wondered if you would share that story with us.
Well, I belong to the Council on Human Relations, which was an interracial organization of research and agitation that was actually started by Southern Regional Council in just after the Brown decision, the school integration decision, was handed down by the Supreme Court. And their idea was that we should have these interracial organizations in all the states, and to help build, help create an atmosphere sympathetic, not just to school integration, but to racial integration in general. A young man, Floyd Johnson, who had just recently arrived in town, and who was the president of the local branch of the NAACP, called us all over to where he was standing on a chair or a barrel or something. And he said, "We're going to have a sit-in." And I looked at Mary, and she looked at me, and I said, "Well, are we going?" And she said, "Of course we're going." And so I said to Floyd, "All right, we'll be there." And Floyd stood up with a pamphlet and read to us, as I recall, what women should do if they were assaulted, what men should do to protect themselves if somebody tried to beat them up. And I turned to Mary and I said, "What was he doing all this for? This is Charlottesville. Anybody going to beat us up?" Which was an incorrect prediction. But anyway, we went, a goodly crowd of white and black went down to a restaurant called Buddy's. It had a slogan, "Just a nice place to eat." And may have been, I never did find out. I never ate there. But we sat at the tables and didn't make any moves to leave. So we stayed until closing time. Then we came back the next day, and on that day, they had a bouncer at the door. So the people who'd been in the sit-in were not allowed to come in, and we stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant as though we were wanting to come in. After a while, 4 men arrived, and made some remarks. You didn't have to be very smart to know that those remarks were indicating they didn't really approve of what we were doing. And then they walked into the restaurant. They were allowed in. Floyd had been at the head of the line of standing outside the restaurant. And he said to me that he was hungry. And Floyd said, well, it's about time time has come for one of your sort to be head of the line.
So you took his place in line.
You get up the head of the line.
Yeah.
And I said, okay. So I went up to the front, and then these fellas came out. And this time, instead of verbal assault, they began pushing and still some of the nasty language. I thought, oh, God, somebody ought to do something. We're going to have trouble here. Oh, I'm ahead of the line. I should do something. So I decided I would go across the street where there was it's where the Cavalier Motel is now. There was nothing there except one of these enclosed telephone booths. And I said, well, maybe I'd better go over and call the police. Police, I thought later, well, that's not a very good idea. But anyway, I was putting my hand in the place where the phone book was kept. I'd never called the police before, and I was just pulling the phone book out to look up the number of the police when this very large man, I'd found out later he'd been a professional prize fighter, this great big fella, and he just put his hands on my shoulders, lifted me out of the phone booth, looked him in the eye and said, you ain't gonna call no damn police. And I thought, as I looked up at him, you know,
Probably not.
No, I said, you're absolutely right. I ain't gonna call no damn police. It was not necessary because the police had watched the whole thing, and when they came by, they did. I said what the guys looked like, and they told me what their names were. They'd seen the whole thing, and then one of them, there were two guys by this time, out of the four, and the short one, he was very small. He hit me here on the chin and then a time on the side of the face. And he looked puzzled, as though he had never hit anyone before who hadn't hit him back. The police came, and I told you that came, I told you that. And then I asked them, several of the sitters in, or now standing out, I said I had to go down and swear out a warrant for these people's arrest, and I really didn't want to do this. I became a kind of hero, but I sure didn't feel like one.
Well, it's a very interesting story, I think, and illustrative of the times, because I know Buddy's, we talked about this before the program, when it became settled law that Buddy had to admit black people, he shut the doors of his restaurant.
That's right.
Rather than relent.
That's right.
On that, and that's a very powerful story, and you were a huge part of it. So of course you became renowned for that and heroic.
Well, yeah, but my stomach hurt. I mean, I wasn't. I wasn't courageous. Look what I did. I wanted the whole damn thing to be over with. I didn't.
It's just human nature. I think. I think what's fascinating to me about the history of Charlottesville, as you bring out in the book, is the changes that took place in a relatively short time. You recount the story of Martin Luther King coming here to speak. At that time, as you pointed out, the university was hesitant to have too much representation there. So the president, for instance, as you mentioned, did not come. And then 5 years later, there's been such a transition for the King Memorial that President Edgar Shannon gave a very moving eulogy, which I thought was a poignant example of, within a 5-year span of time, how much you saw changing in Charlottesville, in Virginia, and at the university. It's astonishing.
And if I can use this phrase, politics matters. Pretty soon, Francis Fife was mayor. After that, Charlie Barber, first black mayor. And the politics of the city changed, and I think in good part as a consequence of the controversy over the city.
It is interesting because politics is always the process, as you know well, of give and take, and how much do you give before rights are taken away, I think is the point I felt very strongly brought out in your book. The price of dissent is a huge issue, and you mentioned, that the issue of loss of money, of friends of security. I know you had threatening phone calls to your home, and many things like that, which came up. There's so much that I would love to ask you about in this book and about your work, but I wanted to circle back to Fairhope and the conflict between principle and pragmatism that we've been discussing, and talk about Nancy Lewis, who she was, and you write a very moving epilogue at the end of the book about her, and I wondered if you would talk about the story as it evolved, and as it concluded when you got to know her granddaughter, Rosetta Lewis.
John Lewis and Nancy Lewis were slaves on a Mississippi plantation. Nancy grew up there, I think, and John was from Virginia and was sold south in the slave trade. And then he met Nancy, and their owner allowed them to get married. And someone must have recommended that they come to this place that was that became Fairhope, and they occupied some land that would later become where my organic school was, and the colony had already purchased this land. It belonged to a man in Mobile named Bowen. John Lewis had paid the taxes on this land, and apparently, this is my guess, that Mr. Lewis, that Mr. Bowen, who owned the land, a white guy, he let them live on the land. I think they had 15 acres or something, and in exchange for paying the taxes on it. Then it turned out my grandfather had to inform the Lewises that the colony had purchased that land, that they owned it. And Nancy Lewis and John didn't own that land. Nancy had to get off the land. She wasn't going to give it up easily. She really cared about the land. She wanted it. That was a very sad thing. So then, what happened next was that there was some land for sale at the county courthouse for non-payment of taxes. And my grandfather got on his horse, Dolly, and rode on the horse. It was about 3 miles up to Daphne, where the sale was going to be. And got there, and Nancy Lewis was there. And she wanted to buy that land to have something secure. And my grandfather he wanted it badly because they didn't have much land. Then he wrote in the minutes book of the colony that he decided to do nothing in the premises. I did not know what that word, in the premises, meant. And it was months, 2 or 3 months later, that I was reading a copy of Progress and Poverty again, and I came across the phrase, in the premises. I got an old dictionary, and it meant in light of previous circumstances. Mm-hmm. We screwed her over once.
We're not going to do it again. So he resolved the issue in a way by including allowing a black person.
It's not colony land.
But adjacent.
It's adjacent, yes. And Nancy Lewis has her land.
But I found very moving, I know you went back to visit Fairhope Community, and it's changed a great deal now, and certainly probably unrecognizable to what it was. But I found it moving that there was a paving stone there that had Nancy Lewis's name on it, and I believe your mother has a paving stone there as well. And so I thought that that was a fascinating, sort of wonderful conclusion, in a way, to the Fairhope experience, even though the community exists as more as an idea, as an ideal now, as opposed to an actual physical place. And yet there's your mother, and there's Nancy Lewis. And how moving that that a grandson of your grandfather and a granddaughter of Nancy Lewis came together and became friends.
Yeah, Rosetta was, I liked her. And when I had a book sale at the bookstore for the book that had it opened with the story of Nancy Lewis, I asked the owner of the bookstore if it would be all right if I asked Nancy Lewis, Rosetta Lewis to come. And she said, oh, sure. So we sat next to each other, and people would come up, and I would inscribe the book to them. And then I'd say, oh, I want you to meet Nancy Lewis's granddaughter, Rosetta Lewis. And I felt good that she was there.
Oh, it's a very moving.
She wrote me a nice
moving
note,
story.
Said I told it like it was. Well,
you have in thinking about how Fairhope became gentrified, I think is what you suggest in the book. You include a quote by James Agee, which I thought was interesting, which is, the deadliest blow that the enemy of the human soul can strike is to do fury honor. And that official acceptance is an unmistakable symptom that salvation has beaten us, and the surest sign that fatal misunderstanding and the kiss of Judas. And I thought that's an interesting comment on the latent racism, which is, we all know, is with us to this day. We have an African American president elected to a second term, and yet the undercurrents remain. And I was put in mind of a quote of Faulkner's from Absalom, Absalom. And of course, his famously has Quentin Compson say, I don't hate the South, I don't. And that is the contradiction in loving your land and yet seeing what is wrong. So from the point of the socials. And Faulkner says, the devious, intricate channels of decorous ordering. And it reminded me very much of, and of course, Faulkner taught at University of Virginia. So, Professor...
and my first office was across the hall from Mr. Faulkner.
Well, you've done so much in your career to enlighten and expose the injustices of civil rights, and you've worked on the front lines with all the important leaders of the movement, and I'm just delighted to have had you here today for a conversation with us. Very, very delighted, and I thank you for doing that, Paul.
Thank you for asking me, Jan. That's very nice of you.
Our thanks to everyone at home for joining our conversation. If you would like more information concerning the topic under discussion today, we invite you to take a look at our website at politicsmatters.org. We will be posting a number of books, articles, and relevant links on the history of civil rights there for you. There will also be a comprehensive archive there of all prior Politics Matters programs, which you may watch in their entirety at any time. We're in the process of revamping our website, which will be completed within the month, and we will be including extended versions of recent interviews in that archive as well. As always, we are particularly interested in hearing from you with any questions, concerns, and ideas for future programs. We encourage you to email us at info@politicsmatters.org. We are on PBS WVPT on the last Sunday of every month at 11:30 a.m. Thank you again, and until next we meet, I'm Jen Painter, and this is Politics Matters.